we are very much looking forward to listening to his view and insight on the global economy and Asian economies and their roles in global economic recovery, as well as the IMF role in enhancing the stability and the growth of the global economy. One problem we have this evening is time constraint. We are supposed to complete today's evening's program by 8 o'clock, but since we started somewhat late, I hope we could have some flexibilities if Mr. Strauss Kahn allows. Let me first, let me tell you about briefly about today's plan. I will introduce Dr. Sargon, who will introduce Mr. Strauss Kahn, and Mr. Strauss Kahn will speak about 30 minutes, which will be followed by Q&A sessions. He has graciously agreed to answer whatever questions you may have from the floor. Now let me first introduce Dr. Il Sargon. Actually, Dr. Sargon does not need introduction here, but if I may, I would like to introduce very briefly about his career. Through his distinguished career of more than 40 years, Dr. Sargon has been an eminent economist, academics, policymaker, administrator, diplomat, and thinker. He was finance minister of Korea in 1980s and was one of the key architects of the economic policy framework of this current administration as a special economic advisor to President. Now he chairs the Presidential Committee for G20 Summit meeting, which is in charge of preparing for Seoul G20 Summit in this coming November in Seoul, which I guess is quite a challenging job. At the same time, he is currently the chairman of Korea International Traders Association, which is another demanding job. And most importantly, he was the founder of this Institute for Global Economics, which I hope he would return after successful completion of his current official duties. So it's a great privilege for us to be able to host two of the most busiest men in the world this evening. And without further ado, may I invite Dr. Sargon to the podium. Please welcome him.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It has been some time now since I last attended this forum, so it's so nice to see you. I forgot to thank Mr. Joe for very kind words of introduction. As Dr. Joe just said, this evening we have very tight time schedule, so I don't think I will waste much time in introducing this evening's guest speaker, whom you know very well already. And I don't think I can do justice to him introducing his long, successful career in both French, the government, and French politics, and French academia, and also as a lawyer. He did various roles in the private sector before he assumed this IMF's managing directorship. So I don't think I will spend much time in going through all the long list of the achievements. Mr. Strauss Kahn assumed, as you know, the office as the 10th managing director of the International Monetary Fund on November 2007. Prior to that, as I said, he was a member of the French National Assembly and the professor of economics at the Institute of Political Studies of Paris. He was re-elected 3 times to the National Assembly, and in 2006 he ran for Socialist Party's nomination for the French president election. Mr. Strauss Kahn served also as a Minister of Economy, Finance and Industry of France from June 1997 to November 1999. In his capacity, he managed the launch of the euro. He also represented France on the Board of Governors of the number of international financial institutions, including, of course, the IMF. Between 1993 and 1997, he was in the private sector as a corporate lawyer, as I mentioned earlier. From 1991 to 1993, he served as a Minister of Industry and International Trade. During that time, he participated in the Uruguay round of trade negotiation. I can go on, but I have to stop here. And he has been managing director, as I said, since 2007. But since then, he has been contributing so much for the IMF and in that the capacity to the whole world. And this is particular privilege for me to have this opportunity to introduce him to you. Yes. Please join me in welcoming.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm very happy to have this opportunity to address such soon after the meeting we had during these days in Daejeon. And as most of you may know, I'm just back with some of you from this conference called Asia 21 that we had in Daejeon with many Asian representatives from the governments, think tanks, NGOs also, which in my view was really successful in trying to rebuild a relationship between the IMF and the Asian countries, which I think it's just fair to say was not that good because of bad memories from what has happened 12 years ago when in the Asian crisis the fund probably did the job which was its job, but did it in a way which left behind a lot of bad memories and the bad feelings, and it was certainly time to try to take stock and rebuild something new at a moment where the Asian economy is so buoyant that it's impossible to consider the future of the global economy without having in mind and without taking care first of the Asian countries. So this conference was, I think, very, very useful, and I have some takeaway that I would like to share with you, mostly on 4 or 5 points. The first one is the way Asian countries are recovering among other countries in the world, and it's probably in a different way, leading the recovery. You know that this recovery in the view of the IMF is rather strong and comes sooner than expected. We just released our last update in Hong Kong a week ago with some revision upwards of our forecast to 4.5% for the global economy this year, and this is rather strong. The main problem, of course, as you all know, is that this recovery is a multi-speed recovery, which means that things are going rather well, let's say more than rather well, in Asia. Also, I would say in most countries of South America, including Brazil, but also smaller countries like Chile or Peru or Colombia. Not badly in Africa, where surprisingly enough, when we look at Africa and compare the situation today with what happened in previous crises, the traditional lag, delay between the global recovery and the recovery in Africa, which was about 1 year, has vanished. And the reality is that the African countries, at low level of income, of course, but have recovered with rate of growth, which are around 5-6%, which is very good news for the African continent. The US, so-so. We don't know exactly. Our forecast is around 3%, a little more than 3%. It's difficult to know if this 3% are going to 4 or are going to 2. We do believe we're rather optimistic, more optimistic than the consensus, and we do believe that the recovery in the US is strong and that the unemployment will eventually decrease at the end of this year, but there's still some uncertainty. And as everybody knows, the main problem in terms of growth remain mostly in European countries, where the forecast we have is around 1 to 1.5% for the coming year, for this year and for the next year, which is obviously too low to have unemployment decreasing, which means that the European countries are still in a problem for a period of time. That's why the exit strategy, everybody has told a lot about exit strategy, cannot be the same in the different countries. The way the crisis has been tackled, addressed, was almost the same everywhere, following in this the advice that the IMF gave probably first as soon as January 2008 of the need of a stimulus to avoid a crisis that could have been as severe as the Great Depression, and we avoided it altogether, and the action to take everywhere were almost the same on the fiscal side and on the monetary policy side. But obviously the exit is a different game, and the exit cannot be the same in Asia, where average growth is 7% this year, and in European countries where average growth will be around 1% or 1.5%. So it has to be country-tailored, and that's probably one of the reasons why the G20 in Toronto was a bit messy, because comments have been made, namely by the news saying, oh, you know, they don't agree together. Some are pushing from support growth still going on. Others are saying it's time to exit and to focus on fiscal sustainability, and that doesn't fit together. Now, that's just right that people have different opinions, but they have different opinions because they're facing different situations. And economic coordination doesn't mean that everybody has to do the same thing. It means that what you have to do has to be discussed with others and to fit with the problem you are facing. Still, this recovery is fragile, and it's fragile because the downside risks are still important. There's an ongoing discussion on the possibility of a double dip, and we don't believe in the IMF that there will be any kind of a double dip. Our baseline scenario is a scenario where the recovery will go on, but of course there are some tail risks, and nobody can say that it's absolutely impossible that we may have a crisis again in the short term. We don't believe it will happen, but we have to consider and to take care of those risks, mainly two of them. One, of course, has to do with the fiscal situation of some countries, and the example everybody has in mind is certainly the Greek example, which is certainly well addressed today by the European Union with the support of the IMF. But even if it's well addressed, and even if I don't believe that any other European country could be in the same situation, you never know, and you never know how markets may react. So there is a risk on this side, and there is also another risk, which has to do with more risk for emerging countries, including Asian countries, which has to do with the fact that a lot of liquidity is still existing in the global economy, that the risk appetite is coming back after the crisis, had disappeared a little during the crisis, at the climax of the crisis, but coming back now. And of course, most investors are reluctant to invest in advanced economies, so they focus on fast-growing emerging economies, including Asian economies, Latin American economies, some others. And so those countries are experiencing huge capital inflows, which from one respect, from one point of view, are welcome when they go to FDI, to direct investment, which are more problematic when they are financial investment that may be temporary investment and may change the investor may change their mind, if not overnight, at least in the short term. So the question for those countries is to know how to manage those capital inflows, and as we all know, capital inflows likely to create asset bubbles, create a disruption in economic policy. So it's a risk that is only a risk. Again, we don't believe that any kind of crisis could materialize this risk when we look at the figures today, but we could not absolutely believe that we're immune to any kind of problem. In Europe, for instance, a very interesting thing is going to happen next week when the European Central Bank will publish the stress test, which has been done on all the big European banks. I'm rather confident that this stress test will show that maybe some small bank may have problem in case of a crisis and should be recapitalized, but I don't believe that it will be the case for many and not at all for the big one. So I think this stress test will be rather reassuring, but we'll see in 1 week. But all this are elements to rebuild a confidence which obviously doesn't exist enough, it's not big enough today. And of course, it has consequences on Asia, because one of the lessons of this crisis is that there is no domestic solution anymore, and we're in a globalized economy, and so we need to have globalized solution. And slow growth in Europe, which represents more or less 25% of the global economy, cannot be without consequences on Asia, especially on exporting Asia, the market of which is mostly in the US and in Europe. And if we have 2-3 years, I don't know, maybe more, of sluggish growth in Europe, of course it will have consequences on the Asian economy. So nobody can sit back and say, that's not my problem, I'm concerned about my own economy, a little more about the economy of my direct neighbors. Everybody have in mind that the globalized economy makes that today everybody has to take care of everybody. What is very remarkable is the resilience of the Asian economy during the crisis. Certainly, the financial sector was not hit directly by the subprime problem because almost all Asian banks didn't have any kind of subprime. But of course, the economy has been hit by the downturn in the global economy. And finally, what we see is that the financial sector resisted very well, certainly partly because the cleansing of this financial sector has been done during the Asian crisis at a high cost, as I said before, and probably it could have been done at a lower cost, but the result is that the balance sheet of the banking sector, of the financial sector, were cleaned up. It's true here in Korea, as in many other Asian countries, and finally, those banks went through the current financial crisis without having too many problems and being able to go on financing the recovery. So, that's the first remark. We are not totally out of the woods, but certainly the apex of the crisis is behind us. So there's still problems looking forward, more or less depending on which part of the world, and very strongly everybody see that the Asian economy has been so resilient that it's obvious today that leading this recovery, the balance of power has changed, and the share in the global economy of Asian countries will increase in the coming decade. So I come to my second point, is that if we look to the future, we need to see how this recovery in the Asian country will go on. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, many do believe that it can hardly rely only on exports. The idea is not to say you should export less, but the problem is that you may export less because of a weaker demand in advanced economy. In this case, what could be the second engine of growth? And there's a story about the second engine growth who has been extensively discussed in Daejeon. Obviously, the idea is that in some countries, mostly the big countries, a shift from a model which was mostly a big, most important example being China, of course, of a model which was mostly an export-led growth model to a more domestic-led growth model is the question at stake. And as many noticed during the conference, including Thai Finance Minister, Mr. Tharman from Singapore. It doesn't mean anything for a small economy. You can't say Singapore, you're going to focus on your domestic market. But it does mean something for big economies. At the other end of the spectrum, you have China. And so the idea is certainly not to say to countries you should back off from globalization, focus on your own economy, not be open to the rest of the world. Absolutely not. The problem is to say maybe your export will not be as big as they were before in case of persistent weak growth in some part of the world, and in this case you need to be able to light on a new engine of growth, and this has to do with developing trade in Asia, and especially the kind of trade which has a final consumer in Asia, because you know that the trade in Asia is very important, but a large part of it is trade in Asia with final consumer outside, which is a bit different from developing services or something like this among Asian countries. How can you do this? Depends upon the countries. In some countries, consumption is obviously the main target. That's the case probably for China, and the way to do that has implication in terms of putting in place a social safety net, which gives more resources to the household, which reduces savings. And some other countries, almost all other Asian countries, the question is more investment, and in private investment, building on public investment in infrastructures. So all this means that different strategy have to be put in place. They also tailored country by country, but that's clearly the direction where to go. With two caveats, two problems that has been clearly underlined during this conference in Daejeon, which has to do with differences, call it sometimes inequalities. Inequalities among countries. And you still have, even if Asia is leading the recovery, you still have many low-income countries in Asia, and the question is, how is it possible to organize a transition for this country from low-income level to emerging countries? And that's not given. It will not happen by chance, and this question of differences among the countries, you had in the conference the finance minister from Bangladesh at the same time as Mr. Yoon, the finance minister of Korea, and obviously that's not the same Asia, even if not so far ago Korea was also a poor country. It shows that it's possible to move, but it will not happen alone. And so the question of having all the countries catching up is something which is one of the problems Asia will have to address. The other one is another kind of inequality, is inequality within the countries. And there's still even if a lot of progress has been made, there's still a large proportion of poor people in the planet living in Asia. And so the question of an inclusive growth, how is it possible to make it that growth will not benefit only to part of the population, but it will be spread over the major party of the population? That's the right question. When the four Asian dragons in the past had this high level of growth, it has been inclusive growth. But during the last 10 or 15 years, the model has been a bit different. And in China, for instance, obviously, development doesn't go so well with reducing the inequality. So that's certainly a concern for big countries, sometimes for small countries. And so there's two kind of discrepancies among countries and within countries are something that has to be addressed, certainly, if Asia wants to have a smooth path of growth at high level in the coming decade. This leads me to my third point, which is with this level of growth and what has already been achieved before the crisis, the role of Asia in the global economy has changed. The G20, which is probably one of the most important events which has happened during the crisis, the emergence of the G20 and the leadership taken by the G20. The G20 includes 6 Asian countries, which shows that Asia is well represented in the G20, of course with Korea, which is the country chairing this year the G20. But the G20 is not everything. It's an important body, informal one. We'll see how it goes on. But in other institutions like the IMF, with the role of which has certainly been enhanced during this crisis, what's the place, the role of Asia? What's the voice of Asia? And so this question of how in the G20 first, but later on I will say a few words about the IMF, the voice of Asia can be listened to is certainly also a question you have to be interested in. In the G20, it may be a little easier because of Korea leadership. And the first time that the G20 at the level of head of state will be chaired by an emerging countries, it's a huge responsibility that Korea has, and so far has done very well. We had a meeting of finance ministers in Busan months ago or so. We will have another one in October, and then the head of state meeting in November. And I think that the agenda which has been set up by the Korean authorities is exactly what we need, and we're working very closely with the Korean authorities on one specific point that I will comment on a little later on. So the role of Asia is important, and one of the exercise, the core activity of the G20 now when the crisis is a bit behind us, is to know how coordinated growth can go on. Coordination was one of the main features during the crisis. The question is, will it go on after the crisis? And to do this, the G20 has decided to set up what we call the MAP, the Mutual Assessment Program, which is a framework in which has been asked to the IMF to build, where basically we use the forecast which were proposed by the different countries, 3 or 4 years forecast, put it together, see if it matches. Of course, there are many reasons why it won't fit, and see how we can do, what we can do to have this consistent, and afterwards being consistent on what we can do to improve the result. And we have shown in Toronto that coordinated action by the G20 members could increase over 5 years the growth by 2.5%, which will represent more than 30 million jobs and more than 40 million people out of poverty. So that's clearly a goal that in Toronto the leaders accepted to endorse, and we have to do in the IMF the work, of course, in clear relationship with the countries, to produce for November the kind of a policy which has to be implemented country by country, which are different, as I said before, to try to reach this common goal, everybody understanding well that everybody will be better off. It's a win-win game. Everybody could be better off if the economic policies are coordinated among the G20 members. But again, then, the role of Asia is major. First, because the size of the Asian economy now is that big, but also because a large part of what can be done is on the shoulder of Asian economies. Another part is on the shoulder of the US, another part of the shoulder of the Europeans, which have to try to reactivate their economies. And it's a different kind of policy which have to be implemented in this different part of the world. But representing now something like 30% of the global economy, it's impossible to achieve the goal I was mentioning without having an active participation of Asian countries. And so, from this point of view, also the role of Asian countries will be very significant. So, let me say a few words about my fourth topic, which has to do with the relationship between Asia and the IMF. As I said, at the beginning of this remarks, I can understand that the memories of the crisis are rather bad and that a lot has to be done to try to renew the relationship. I think that we all understand that it's the interest of Asia wanting to have its word in the global economy to renew relationship with the IMF, and it's an interest in the IMF, which cannot be a multilateral institution dealing with the global economy without dealing directly with the Asian. So it's the interest of both, and because it's the interest of both, I think it's working, and the meeting, the conference in Daejeon was clearly a sign of this. What does it mean? It means that we need to engage more with Asian countries in different way. I will explain this a little more in a minute. But it means also that some old devil has to be killed. And for instance, let me just mention one. I remember when I was finance minister in 1998, we had the IMF annual meeting in Hong Kong. And there was a ghost going around everywhere, kind of elephant in the room that nobody wanted to address, but was obvious for everybody. This was this idea launched at this time by the Japanese of an Asian monetary fund. And I was a young minister at this time. I didn't understand exactly what was at stake, but obviously people were talking, including very much in the IMF, about this possibility, saying, no way, that's something against us, and we have to fight against this Asian monetary fund. There's only one monetary fund, which is the International Monetary Fund, and this kind of thing. As always, when you try to build something at the international level, it takes time, and we're 12 years later, and we're just arriving at the moment where this Asian, the Chiang Mai Initiative, May, which is kind of a beginning of this possible Asian Monetary Fund, is likely to begin. The problem is that I think we have totally to change our mind in the IMF. And contrarily to this idea that we should not agree, and even we should fight against the existence of regional arrangement, I think exactly the contrary. Regional arrangements are welcome, and there is no reason why the fund couldn't work with regional entities when they exist, and we just prove it in dealing with the European Union within the Greek case, and we are very happy not to have to deal with the Greek case alone. For a couple of months, the Europeans were not that happy to have to deal with the IMF, but finally they came to the conclusion that even if they have some very strong and organized integration of the economy at the European level, they were not able to deal with the Greek case alone because it needs some expertise that the fund has, some experience that doesn't exist anywhere else. And so finally they came to this conclusion that the right way to do was to organize the cooperation between what they were building, the EFSF, the European Financial Stability Facility, and the IMF. In the same way, I see the cooperation between CMI and the fund very rather easy, and I think that's the right thing to do. And if in other parts of the world, in Latin America or I don't know where, other kind of initiative goes in the same direction, I would be very happy to help them. So that's the kind of old problem that I think have disappeared, must disappear. Still we have current problems, which are enough, and so we don't need to put extra problem on the agenda. Current problem is, for instance, the so-called problem of quota and voice, which is very well known, and for Asian countries, which has to do with the representation of Asian countries in the IMF. As you know, we, as the Pittsburgh communique has asked us, we committed to a shift of 5% of the voting rights from advanced economies to dynamic emerging economies, from overrepresented countries to underrepresented countries by, well, first in Pittsburgh has been said by January 2011, and now I think that it will be possible at the request of the chairmanship, the Korean chairmanship of the G20, to complete it for the Seoul meeting, which will be a big achievement of the Seoul meeting in November. It's not easy. It's not easy because shifting 5% means that some countries have to lose this 5%. And I have on my desk a long list of countries wanting to increase their share, but I have a very small list of countries wanting to decrease their share. The total has to add up to 100, and my only luck in this story is that I'm not really in charge of this job because it's a question among the membership. But in fact, staff and management of the IMF are working, of course, with the membership to try to achieve this, and it's a rather difficult bargain. Nevertheless, I do believe that it will be possible to make it, and even more important than the quotas themselves, to have a ranking of the countries which will show that something like the half of the board of the IMF, the board is 24 members, so half of the board is 12 members, will represent the 12 biggest economy in the world, so we will get rid of these anomalies that we still have, where big economies are less represented than some smaller economies, which looks very odd. For Asian countries, it means something. It means that obviously the share of Asian countries will increase, most of them, if not all of them. I don't know about very small countries in Asia, but for big countries it will be the case, and that's a very important result, because my proposal at the Daejeon meeting yesterday and today was that I would like to act in a way that Asia will feel at home in the IMF. I say that the IMF has to be a second home for Asia. Fine, but to feel at home you need to have enough room. And to have enough room means that some countries, mostly European countries, have to accept to release, to give some part of their voting rights to Asian countries. Not only Brazil is also increasing, some others, but mostly Asian countries. So it's a difficult deal, but I think we can make it. So all this, and that's my last point, is what I call the Daejeon deliverables. From this point of view, the conference was very useful, and 3 points have to be delivered. Let me just mention it rather rapidly. The first one is that our analysis have to be more useful and more available for Asian countries. It has to do with early warning, new kind of early warning that we're building. It has to do with the spillover analysis that we are making now to see how what happened in one country may have consequences on other countries. It has to do also with more even-handed analysis, because it has been said, was it true, was it wrong? I don't care. The problem is that it's a perception of uneven-handedness which cannot go on. Most emerging countries saying, well, you're not as tough with advanced economy as you are with emerging economies. When you listen to Greek unions demonstrating in the street, I'm not quite sure that people can still go on saying the same thing. But if there is some perception in Asia that IMF is not even-handed enough, then we have to make progress on this. And of course it has also to do with more outreach to explain again and again that we are your institution, we are at your service, and that we are everywhere where we have an activity, technical assistance, a crisis program, it's always to try to help the country to fix the problem. So more analysis, more available, more useful for the country. The second thing is maybe the most important. It has to do with the building of the financial safety net that has been proposed by the Korean authorities, and which basically relies on a very strong idea that we need to renew our facility toolkit to be closer to the problem that may happen in the global economy today. We built the FCL, the flexible credit line, during the crisis, has been very helpful, but can be improved. But beyond the FCL, which is focused on what I call the platinum members, the member of the Fed having perfect policy in place, we may need something else. For other countries, a set of 40, 50 countries having rather good policy in place, nevertheless being likely to be hit by some systemic crisis, that's what we call the precautionary credit line. And then a third level on which a lot has been discussed with the Korean authorities, which is a kind of multi-country approach to support by the IMF. And the idea there, which is I think very important, is that to try to fight against the stigma which is still attached to the fact that the country deals with the IMF. The country comes to the IMF means they have a problem. The fact that many countries together in the same region, for instance, facing a kind of a beginning of systemic crisis, asked together to the IMF to put in place some safety net, could fight effectively this stigma problem. So we're working on that too. It's not yet completed, far from that. Difficult discussion within the board of the IMF, but I'm confident that for the the November meeting it will be done. And then the last deliverable, I spoke about it already, I'm not going to elaborate more, has to do with quota and voice. So better advice, analysis, support, technical assistance to our member in Asia, first deliverable. Financial safety net, second deliverable. Quota and voice, third deliverable. That's the agenda which has been set up in Daejeon and to which I'm committed for the coming year. If we succeed on all this point, and we have to, a big part of it can be done, has to be done for the Seoul summit, that certainly in 1 year from now, it will be possible to say that the relationship between Asia and the fund not only have changed, I think that already have changed, but that we are back to normalcy and that Asian representing something like 1/3 of the global economy has its voice and his correct representation in this global institution and is likely to to show the leadership that the Korean authority are showing for the G20, but that has to go beyond the chairmanship of the G20 for most of Asian countries, because the G20 is a very important thing, but life will go on after 2010, and so we have together to prepare what's going to happen in the global economy in the coming 2 or 3 or 4 years after. It's long term, and as you remember, all Keynes said that in the long term probably we'll all be dead, so let's focus on the coming 2 or 3 years. It will be enough for us. That's what we did in Daejeon, and I want again to thank the Korean authorities, including Minister Yoon, Dr. Sakong, for what they did during this conference. I also want to thank Il Sakong and Mr. Nam for inviting me tonight and have this opportunity to address this audience, and I would be happy to answer your question if any. Thank you.
May I ask 2 questions? The one is, what is the IMF's strategic position toward the European Union to rehabilitate so-called PIGS, PIGS country financial crisis? In another word, IMF is going to deal that problem en bloc or en bloc of EU or the respective country, member country by member country. The second question is, do you think that Republic of Korea's past experience of IMF financial crisis back in 1987 to 1991 will be helpful to solve PIGS problem? Do you think that same Korea's strict conditionality of the emergency loan will put on the PIGS, or you will have the very rather loose Mexican type of liquidity preference conditionality? That is my 2 questions.
Call this country more now the gypsy, so I could advise you to use rather this word. The point is that, in the IMF, our membership is our only countries. And I won't say, because it will look odd, that we don't know what the European Union is, but in fact, the European Union is not a member of the fund, and the members are countries. So we only act with a country when the country asks it. We are not the kind of I have nothing against bankers, but a commercial banker that come on, knock at your door and say, I would like to have business with you. We have to wait for the country to ask us to come. So it was the case for Greece, where we had to wait that at the end of the day the Greek government asked the IMF for some support. And for other countries that may need some support, I'm not sure it will be necessary, but if it is necessary for some, they cannot deal with that problem alone, we have to wait for them to come to us. So the question for us is not to say we have a global strategy for European countries and we're going to impose this strategy to the European countries. That doesn't work that way. We have to work for the members to come to ask us if they do. Now, on the second point, certainly the experience of the past is useful. The fact that conditions are necessary when you have some support from the IMF is challenged by no one, because when we need to work with a country, in most cases, it's because they have things to be changed, and the conditions are there to be sure that the agreed changes between the government and the IMF will be implemented. But the experience of the past, and mostly the Asian crisis, as you say, not only in Korea but also in Thailand and in Indonesia, is that certainly the IMF had, among other drawbacks, the used to try to fix too many problems at the same time. When you drive your car to the garage because you have a problem with your wheel, you want the garage to fix the wheel. You don't want the garage to tell you at the same time, oh, but you have also a problem with the engine, and you have also a problem with the color and the glasses and whatever. Because then you're just unable to pay. If I transport this analogy to our problems, countries cannot deal with fixing all the problems together. And with the best intention, the IMF was dealing with the countries to help fixing all the problems in the economy, which is just impossible, make it politically impossible and economically very difficult and socially sometimes very painful. So we now have learned to be more focused on what is absolutely needed to fix the problem at stake, and that's largely comes from the lesson drawn from the Korean or Asian experience. So we're still, the new IMF is still the IMF, and it means that there is in no way we could deal with a country without having tough conditions, but because what needs to be done has to be done. And as I said before, if you look at the Greek program, I think it's well adjusted, not too tough, because it has to be implemented, and the people already, it will be painful for the Greeks, and if it's too painful, it just doesn't happen. But on the other hand, it has to be tough enough to address the problem. And this kind of measures and judgment that we may have has been, of course, draw a lot on the lesson from the Asian crisis.
My name is Ji Kim, advisor to Chairman of the Hyoson Corporation. Thank you for your very eloquent and broad coverage of the world economy. Since World War II, the world has been very prosperous under the Bretton Woods system, of which your organization is very instrumental. Now, during the period, we can see two very prominent effects. Starting from Japan, many of the countries, like NICS and now China, have developed very rapidly, but to a large extent, it was sponging on the previously developed large economies, most prominently in the US. At the same time, also, throughout the world, most of the governments' indebtedness has been increasing. So, one way to look at it is we may have prosperity today, but that can be said we have been eating off our future generations' wealth. And therefore, as we go forward, beyond just solving this crisis and getting out of exit strategy itself, we have a very fundamental issue of how to find the new paradigm which can be everlasting. How do you see the problem?
Because the question you're raising is to say basically that the global economy after the crisis cannot be the same as the global economy before the crisis, which is absolutely true. And if we have some idea of what was the global economy before the crisis, we don't know exactly what is the new paradigm, and your question from this point of view is very accurate. For Asian countries, it means something new that you noticed, the fact that the rapid growth for most Asian countries until now has been just to catch up with the way which was shown and the track which was built, has been built in the past by Europeans and the American economy. Now, with Asian countries being at the forefront, you will have to be part of the invention of the new model, or you will have to be the inventor of the new model, certainly with others, not alone, but the idea cannot be alone to only to copy what has been done elsewhere. And in my view, the main change, but it will need much more elaboration to explain this, is in what I tried to mention previously, which is economic coordination. The main change for me is that economic strategy for most countries until now have been a domestic strategy. Of course, trying to take into account what the others are doing, but mostly with strategists thinking inside the country, what should we do? The change is that there's no more any we working alone. And what the crisis has taught us is that even the crisis originated in a small part of the US economy, in the housing sector, may have consequences all across the world. So the only way to build something is to build it together. And this feeling that we need to work together and that the global economy is really a global economy, which is finally relatively new, this feeling and this impression was very strong when the consensus in Washington first, in London then, and in Pittsburgh took place to the measures which were needed to address the crisis. What I'm a little worried about is that in the wake of the crisis, this willingness to work together, well, the willingness is still there, but the effectiveness is questionable, and everybody is going home, a little doing business as usual. All the leaders have to do with their own domestic problem, which is understandable, but at the same time they forget a little the need to work together. So I don't know exactly what the new paradigm is, and we have to work on this together. We will have in the IMF, let me advertise a little for this, at the beginning of next year, a very important conference on a theoretical level on this question, and we're working on that. But even if I don't know exactly how now, I'm not able to make a list of assumptions and consequences of those assumptions, defining the way I see the global economy working in the coming decade. What I'm sure is that we have a huge advantage and a huge, we can make a huge step forward if we accept going on with cooperation. And that's why this meeting in the G20 meeting in Seoul is so important, because it will be the first one, just in the middle, in the aftermath of the crisis, before the new period, and if the spirit of consensus and if the will to work together is still strong in Seoul, then we can have a good chance to have it going on for the next meeting. If it's not the case, and if it appears in Seoul that most of the leaders, well, are happy to discuss together, but finally are not decided to commit themselves, then certainly it will mean that one of the main legacy of the crisis has been lost. So let's talk later on, maybe on building a new spherical consensus on what will be the economy in the coming decades. Certainly the Washington consensus is dead. Now we have to create a new one. Will it be the Seoul consensus? Maybe. We'll see in November. But it's something which we have to work on.
You said earlier today that you're working with current authorities to come up with regional-based, integrated safety nets to address the opposing ideas pushed by some of the advanced economies in China as well. But there's a worry that there's a lot of all talk but no action kind of thing going on. So is there a chance that if those countries still oppose to the idea, is there a chance that emerging economies set up their own? And if that's the case, what's IMF going to do? Well, is IMF going to support the regional safety net or not? Thank you for that.
So the discussions which are taking place in the board of the IMF today on this financial safety net are improving the process that we try to put in place, and I'm confident that we will be able to deliver. Now your question is, if it doesn't happen, is there any solution at the regional level? Well, I said before how much in favor of regional arrangement I am, and I do believe that regional arrangements are very important, but I don't believe that those regional arrangements can work alone. And that's the example of the European Union from this point of view is very strong. There is no such a thing that the European Union in Asia, and you're far from that. It took 40 years to build something as integrated as the European Union, and even this arrangement, very sophisticated already, was unable to deal with the Greek case alone. So I think there's no chance, because of the interlinkages in the global economy, for many other reasons, there is no chance that regional arrangement will be enough. On the other hand, I'm not saying that the IMF alone is enough either, and that's why we need to work together. So the good solution is to have this coordination and the two kind of institutions being complementary. I think that's the right way to go. It will be very difficult for the IMF to deal with question alone, and it will be almost impossible for regional arrangement to deal with this kind of problem alone too.
Good evening, Dr. Strauss Kahn. James Rooney of Market Force and the Vice Chairman of the Seoul Financial Forum. And I was fortunate enough to be in Korea in 1997-98 when we had our own crisis. And actually, I think in truth, Korea really appreciates the help that was given by the IMF, notwithstanding whether there were some hasty decisions or some errors made along the way. Korea today is clearly stronger for it. You mentioned a number of things, and I congratulate you on your positive view of the Daejeon Conference and your very positive view on the outlook for the Seoul G20 in November. In your 3 points, you mentioned about the map, this integrating economic model. And actually, I'm amazed I didn't realize we didn't have one already. I would have thought there was a map of the world already, but if there isn't, I hope you'll build a good one. But you also said that the IMF's role is to sort of sit back and wait until somebody comes knocking on the door. And forgive me for my presumption, but I would like to suggest something to you. Maybe it's already in your mind, but I'd like to put it right out front. I don't think it helps that the IMF is based in any one place, and certainly not necessarily in North America. I think it's necessary to be effective that you are proactively out in the market, anticipating. Wouldn't it have been much nicer if the 2008 crisis had been headed off before it happened? If there had been mechanisms, including your map perhaps, that would have shown these potential problems before they became too severe, and some intervention could have made them less extreme. So you said that you hope that Asia will start to feel that it has more of a home in the IMF. But actually my message for you is I hope that you will feel that the IMF can have more of a home in Asia, and perhaps Korea is the best place for you to start by establishing something more permanent representing the IMF in Korea and again around the world more broadly, so that you're not sitting waiting for that call when the patient's already dying, but you're out there becoming an integrated part and coordinating using this map device, discussion between economies that allow them to see their problems before they become severe. So it's not one country by one country, everybody out there for themselves, but it truly becomes an integrated global economy.
I had in mind in the crisis period when we cannot intervene in a country and finance a country before the country asks us to do it. But of course, on a day-to-day basis, we try to be proactive, and a large part of what we're doing is having a kind of surveillance activity that is the core of our business, giving policy advice, technical assistance to countries needed, and that's a bit under the surface, because what is seen in the newspaper is only when we have to step in to fix a crisis. But most, well, I won't say most, but half of our resources are devoted to this kind of building early warning, having the early warning exercise, trying to have a view of what may happen in the economy, looking at the spillover that may happen if something happened in the country, what may happen in other country, and all this kind of thing. So don't have in mind, but I'm sure you didn't have it really, this idea that we are just as a bookkeeper waiting for people for asking for our support and being happy when nobody knocks at the door so we can sleep easily. Now the other part of your question or your remark is that to be really a global economy, a global institution, the IMF should be closer to its members, and having headquarters in Washington may not be the best thing. At least we should have more people in the field. That's true. It's true in two ways. First, the fact that the headquarters of the IMF are in Washington is embedded and enshrined in the Article of Agreement, the treaty, which says clearly that the headquarters of the IMF have to be on the territory of the biggest shareholder. That's why when I was the finance minister of my country, I was fighting so strongly in favor of a single chair for the euro, because in this case, the euro would have been the main shareholder and we could have the headquarters in Paris, which for many people would have been more convenient. But besides this point, the real question is not that much if the IMF is, as is often say, a Washington-based institution or not, but the question is whether or not we have enough people in direct relationship and contact with the members. And certainly it would be very good, I follow your point, your idea, it would be very good for us to be able to have more people in the field. The question is only a cost question, and also it's a strategy question. What is the cost question? Well, as an institution, we have a budget, we have constraints. We could say it's ridiculous if really that can avoid any kind of crisis. The gain is so big that being too tough on your budgets is ridiculous. I would agree, but then I would be very happy to hire you and convince a member of my board that they should allow us to hire more people. It's not exactly the mood these days, but well, it's good to have constraint on your budget, not to make foolish things. On the other hand, we have to try to go closer. But there is also a strategic reason why it's difficult, not only a resource question, which is that one very important thing for the IMF, as I mentioned before, is to be even-handed, but also to be consistent. And to be consistent, we need to have the people working together in the headquarters, and that's a big difference with the World Bank. The World Bank is much bigger than the IMF in terms of staff. We have 2,500 people when they have 12,000 people, because they're dealing with projects, project financing. And to finance a dam or whatever in a country, you need to be on the fields. And there is no really need to have a global vision of the global economy at this time to do the job you have to do in the field, financing the dam. It's not the same thing for the IMF, where we could not have a decentralized IMF with people meeting together from time to time, but not be inspired by the same view of the global economy at any moment. So we need to have a centralized institution. Nevertheless, having a centralized institution, we could have more people, not all the people, but more people in the field. I was very pleased to hear Minister Jung praising our representative here, which is next to you, in Seoul, and telling us how well they were working together. And I must say, he won't be happy because it will decrease a little the merits, but I must say that's the case in most countries, when we don't have a resident representative everywhere, but where we have those, in 99% of the cases, the authorities are very happy to be able to exchange ideas, to discuss economic policy with the IMF member in their country, and they're all asking for more people. So you're absolutely right in proposing this. We could try to be more present in the field, and we will try to do it. One way to do it without increasing our budget is, for instance, what we did last week. For the first time, we released our update in WEO in the World Economic Outlook in Hong Kong, rather than doing it as always before in Washington. And it had much bigger the outreach was much bigger than before, and it showed that we were present, and of course we were focused more on Asia than we did in the past. So we have that different way to try to do it, but the direction is the one you mentioned, that we need to be closer to our membership.
And it's a very short question. What's your view on Tobin tax and capital controls?
It's a very pragmatic view. I was talking before about the large capital inflows that we are contemplating these days. And those capital inflows can be very disruptive for economic policy in a country. So what can the country do? The normal answer is to let the currency appreciate. But there is a limit. At one point in time, the country may consider that the currency is at the right level, that further appreciation will damage exports, for instance, and that they don't want to do it. So what's the second line of defense? The second line of defense is very well known, which is to accumulate reserve and sterilize the reserve, because if not, it make a problem with your monetary policy. But you can't do this forever. And then the question of the monetary policy is the question which is at stake. And very big neighbor here knows what this problem may mean. So also this way to try to deal with, to cope with large capital inflows has its own limit. Then you may have a third line of defense, which has to do with the prudential rules and the way you are establishing the functioning of capital markets and the stock market. But also this has its own limit. And then when you have used all the tools, you may still have too big capital inflow that you want to limit. In this case, I think countries really have to be pragmatic. Capital control can be useful. Of course, they have also drawbacks, so it can be only on a temporary basis, and they cannot expect that it will solve the problem for a long time. It cannot be a way to hide and avoid to make the structural reform that may be needed. But on a short-term basis, when really you have a huge capital inflow that are disruptive and that may derail your economic policy, it's a pragmatic answer that countries cannot reject only for ideological reason. And when a few months ago, well now it's 8 months ago, Brazil decided to put in place a kind of a capital control, they called IMF, they say, you know, we're going to do this, you won't like it. And I say, well, not that much that I won't like it, that I think it won't be that effective because it doesn't work. But if it works, fine, just try to do it. And they did it. I was a bit wrong. It worked a little, but it didn't work for a long time. And so that's an illustration of the pragmatic view I was mentioning. If something works, they may have some drawbacks, but the drawbacks may be smaller than doing nothing, then you better do it. If finally the drawbacks are bigger than the advantage that you keep from the measure, you better don't do it. And really this has to be seen on a pragmatic view. But in any case, that can only be something which is temporary, because when you have on and on huge capital inflows, then you have to take structural measures that cannot rely on capital controls.
We are all grateful to Mr. Strauss Kahn for his insights and his frank assessment and observations on Asian economy, global economy. And also we appreciate his effort and also the IMF's effort to strengthen the partnership between Asian countries and the IMF. He is, as I said, one of the busiest men in the world, and he was very generous in sharing his time with us this evening. We are already nearly half hour over the scheduled time. Finally, I wish best to Mr. Strauss Kahn for his endeavor to strengthen the role of the IMF and its contribution to the global economy, and whatever personal aspiration he may have for his future career. I don't know whether my comment will be welcomed by him, or I don't know whether this comment is appropriate at this place, but one day we hope we would be able to welcome him in Korea as President of the French Republic. With that, let me call the end to on today's formal program. Of course, we can continue your conversation on the dinner tables. Once again, we are so grateful for your time and your insight that you shared with us this evening. May I suggest giving him another big hand?